Okay, so today we're going to do a deep dive into one of Al-Ghazali's later works, Mishkat al-Anwar, which translates to the Nichphilites.
You got it.
And this is sort of, I guess you could say, a follow-up to his more famous autobiography, Deliverance from Error,
Yeah.
where he really kind of gets into some of his more esoteric thought.
Right.
And what's really interesting is that this particular work sparked a lot of conversation, even among Muslim thinkers, who you wouldn't think would be fans of some of Ghazali's more mystical ideas.
Yeah, you think about folks like Ibn Tufayl and Ibn Rushd and these sorts of people
Yeah.
who, they were coming at it from different angles.
Yeah.
So our deep dive today is going to look specifically at this work and try understand some of its core ideas,
Right.
focusing especially on his sort of unique interpretation of the Quran's light verse and the veils tradition.
Yeah, and the idea here, I guess, is that we want to give our listeners sort of a shortcut to understanding some pretty complicated concepts.
Yeah, some heavy philosophical and religious, content that he's unpacking here.
Yeah, and Ghazali structures this work in three parts.
Right.
The first part, he kind of looks at the whole concept of light in all its different forms. Then he dives into the importance of symbolic language in religious texts like the Quran.
Yeah.
And then finally, he applies all of this stuff to the light verse and the tradition of the 70,000 veils.
Right, right.
So let's start, I guess, with section 1 and this idea of the nature of light.
Sure, yeah.
Ghazali starts out talking about the light that we see.
Right, physical light.
Physical light, the sun and, the moon and stars and so forth.
The things we can perceive.
The things we can perceive.
With our senses, yeah.
Right, and then he kind of moves into this idea of the light of the eye. And I guess that's this idea that...
Well, this is where he really starts to get interesting, because he moves from just sort of the physical perception of light to the idea that we have a kind of inner light, and that this inner light allows us to perceive not just the physical world, but also the world of intellect.
Right.
The world of ideas and concepts.
Right. And so then he kind of takes it to the next level and he talks about...
And then from there, he goes even further.
Yeah.
He starts talking about prophets as lights.
The prophets as lights.
Angels as lights, and ultimately Allah as the ultimate light.
Right.
And it's really interesting here because he makes this sort of radical claim that Allah is not just a source of light. He's actually the only real light.
Oh, wow.
And what that means is that all other forms of light are ultimately derived from him.
So even the sun...
Even the sun.
...is somehow a reflection of...
Ultimately a reflection...
With the divine light.
Of the divine light.
Right. And this kind of reminds me of, the Gospel of John.
Yeah.
The first chapter where it says that in him was life, and the life was the light of men.
Right. This idea of Christ as the Logos.
Yeah.
The divine word, the divine light. But Ghazali is really taking this idea and sort of pushing it to its logical extreme.
Yeah.
And saying that this is really the only way to understand the absolute uniqueness and transcendence of God.
Okay, so that's section 1, this idea of the nature of light.
Right, the hierarchy of light.
So how about section 2?
Sure. So section 2...
How does he deal with the whole issue of symbolism?
Yeah, so in section 2, Ghazali dives into what he calls the science of symbolism. And for him, symbols are much more than just metaphors.
Right.
They're not just sort of literary devices.
Right.
He's talking about a real connection, almost a mystical connection between the symbol and what it represents.
Right.
So he talks about this in terms of type and anti-type, or outer and inner.
Right.
And he even goes so far as to say that nearly every object in the physical world perhaps has a spiritual counterpart.
Oh, wow.
And, this reminds us of Plato's theory of forms, where you have these sort of perfect ideas that exist in the realm of the eternal, and then you have their imperfect copies in the physical world.
Right.
And it also reminds us of the epistle to the Hebrews in the New Testament, where it talks about the earthly tabernacle being a copy and shadow of the heavenly one.
Yeah.
So what Ghazali's doing here is really elevating the importance of symbols.
Right.
And saying that they're not just something that we can sort of arbitrarily interpret.
Right.
There's actually a real connection between the symbol and what it represents.
So what does all this mean for his understanding of religious practice?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
Because Ghazali argues that this deep connection between symbol and reality means that both the outward practice of religious law, which he calls the zahir.
Okay.
So think of all the observable rituals of Islam.
Right.
And its inner meaning, which he calls the batin, are equally important.
Okay, so the inner intention.
The inner intention, the understanding the spiritual reality behind the rituals.
So it's not enough just to go through the motions.
Exactly. You can't just go through the motions.
You have to really understand.
You have to understand the deeper meaning.
The deeper meaning.
And this is actually a really important point.
Okay.
Because it provides a kind of philosophical basis for why even the most advanced Sufis, who were often accused of neglecting the outer forms of religion, remain dedicated to those forms.
Okay.
So they understood that the outer forms were important,
Right.
not just for themselves, but also for the community.
Right, for maintaining the tradition.
Right, for maintaining the tradition.
So they weren't just being hypocrites, they were actually...
Exactly. They weren't just being hypocrites.
really trying to live out...
They were trying to live out both the outer and the inner.
Yeah, both the outer and the inner.
The aspects of the faith.
Okay, so then he gets into section 3, and now he's ready to apply all this stuff
Exactly.
to the light verse and the veiled tradition.
Right.
So let's start with the light verse.
Yeah, so how does he understand this light verse?
Yeah.
Well, he interprets the imagery of the light verse on multiple levels. So you have the light, you have the niche, you have the glass, the oil, the tree, the east and the west.
Right.
And he's seeing a psychological meaning in these symbols. He's seeing religio-metaphysical meaning.
So it's not just a literal...
It's not just a literal interpretation.
Right.
He's really unpacking these symbols.
Right.
And trying to understand all their different layers of meaning.
Okay, so how about the veils tradition? This idea that there are 70,000 veils.
Yeah, so this is where he gets into the idea of spiritual ascent.
Mm-hmm.
So the veils tradition is this idea that there are 70,000 veils of light and darkness separating God from the soul.
Okay.
And this idea probably has its roots in Neoplatonism, this idea of a hierarchical universe emanating from a single source.
Right.
But Ghazali uses this tradition to categorize different human natures and beliefs based on how close they are to the absolute truth.
So the closer you are to the truth.
The closer you are to the truth, the fewer veils you have.
Right.
And the further away you are,
The more veils.
the more veils you have.
Fair.
And he even outlines 4 classes of mankind based on these veils.
Oh, wow.
So you have the people who are in pure darkness. Then you have the people who have a mixture of darkness and light.
Okay.
Then you have the people who are veiled by pure light.
Okay.
And then finally you have the unveiled, the people who have seen through all the veils.
And are they the prophets?
Well, he doesn't explicitly say who the unveiled are.
Okay.
But it's a very interesting thought that even those who we might consider to be very devout believers could still be within these veiled categories.
Right.
Because they haven't yet reached that level of complete understanding.
So basically what you're saying is that Mishkat al-Anwar offers us this really layered understanding.
Yeah, it's a very rich text.
Of light and the nature of symbols.
Yeah, a profound understanding of symbols.
And ultimately the stages of spiritual ascent.
And a very unique way of classifying human understanding and beliefs.
Yeah, and he leaves us with some pretty intriguing questions.
Yeah, like what exactly is the nature of human intelligence's connection to the divine?
Right.
And who is this commander of the universe that he mentions?
Yeah, I was wondering about that too.
These are questions that really sparked debate among later thinkers.
Yeah, and it makes you think about, how we might apply this idea of veils to our own understanding.
Absolutely.
Could our own biases and perspectives act as veils?
Absolutely. Our own preconceptions.
That kind of limit our ability to really see the truth.
Could be preventing us from seeing things clearly.
Yeah, it's definitely food for thought.
Food for thought.
All right, well, thanks for joining me on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
Into Al-Ghazali's Mishkat al-Anwar.
Yeah, fascinating text.
And we'll see you next time.
See you later.